Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Bharatiya Darshanik Manch. Sorry, I was not able to upload the videos as I was not well. Today, we are going to start the Nyaya Metaphysics. It is another lecture in our Indian Metaphysics series. And in this series, we have already studied Charvaka Metaphysics, Jain Metaphysics, and Buddhist Metaphysics. Now, moving forward, as we already know what metaphysics means, it means the theory of reality, where we try to understand about the reality, the physical world that is in front of us or where we live, and we try to understand about the soul, the God, the consciousness, and the life before birth, life after death. These are the things that we study in metaphysics. So now, what is the perspective of Nyaya theory about the physical world? We are going to start with this. So first thing that comes here is the word pramay that you must have heard many times. What is the meaning of pramay? It means the objects of knowledge. So all the objects of knowledge that we need to know the world and other things related to us are the pramayas. And according to Nyayikas, the object of knowledge are self, the body, the senses, and the objects of the senses. Also, mind, pravritti or activity, those or the mental imperfections, pratyabhav or rebirth, phala or the feelings of pleasure and pain, dukha or suffering, apvarga or absolute freedom from all suffering. These are also the pramayas or the knowable objects. Then there are also such objects as dravya or what we say in English substance or guna or quality, karma or motion, samanya or universal, then vishesh or particularity, samvay or the relation of inherence, and abhav or non-existence. These are also the things that are pramayas, that are the knowable objects. All of these pramayas or knowables are not to be found in the physical world because it includes only those objects that are either physical or somehow belong to the world of physical nature. So all of these pramayas are not found in physical world. What we found in physical world has to be related or has to be a compound of the elements, right? The five elements or the Panch Mahabhutas that we have studied many times, that the objects which are present in the physical world are the objects that we can see, we can touch, or we can have the knowledge of those objects with any of our senses. Those are the pramayas or the knowable objects that are there in the physical world. But what about the self? Can we see self? Can we touch it? As we can touch the table or the chair, in that manner we cannot touch the self. And the attributes of knowledge and manas, they are not at all physical. We cannot touch mind, we cannot see mind. It is not present to us as any physical object is present in front of us. Now talking about time and space. These are two substances which, although different from the physical substances, yet they somehow belong to the physical world. Time and space, though we cannot perceive it, both of them, we cannot perceive them, we can at least have an inference about them. right? Now Akash is a physical substance which is not a productive cause of anything. Akash, Nyayikas are considering Akash as a physical substance, but they are considering it as it is not a productive cause of anything. It is not producing anything. It is just a physical substance. The physical world is constituted by the four physical substances of earth, water, fire and air. So the physical world that we see, that we touch, that we have knowledge about with the help of our sense data, they are constituted by four physical substances: earth, water, fire and air. And the ultimate constituents of these four substances are the eternal and unchanging atoms of earth, water, fire and air. These four substances are composed of atoms. They can be further divided, but these atoms cannot be further divided. So the atoms of earth makes earth, the atoms of water makes water or produces water, the atoms of fire produces fire and the atoms of air produces air. So these atoms, which are the partless elements, they are eternal and unchanging. They cannot be changed and they are eternal. Now Akash or ether, and Kal or time, and Dik or space. You have to remember, in the Nyaya Metaphysics or in the understanding of Nyaya philosophy, wherever we are using the word Dik, it means the space. For some people it is a new word, and for others, of course, who have already studied, for them it is not that new. Now Akash, Kal or Dik, these three are eternal and infinite substances. Akash is present there eternally and it is infinite. Time is present there and it is infinite, and also space is present there and it is also infinite. And each of them is one single whole. So they cannot be further divided. Akash cannot be further divided, time cannot be further divided, and space cannot be further divided. But as we were talking about the other four elements, earth, water, fire, air, they are further divided and they are composed of atoms. Now the physical world is the product of the four kinds of atoms, which is earth, water, fire and air. It contains all the composite products of these atoms and their qualities and relations, including organic bodies, the senses, and the sensible qualities of things. So the world, the physical world, which is composed of the atoms of earth, water, fire, air, then the composite product of these atoms, the composite product of earth, water, fire, air, and the composite product of their qualities and the composite product of their relations and the senses and the sensible qualities, all these things are contained in physical world. To it belong also the physical substance, Akash or ether. So Akash also belong to the physical world, and the non-physical substances of time and space. So Akash, time and space, they all belong to physical world with all their various relations and apparent modifications, right? So that's how the physical world is composed. It is composed of earth, water, fire, air, and the composite products of earth, water, fire, air, then Akash, and time and space. All these things together produces or make a physical world. Now the Nyaya theory of the physical world in respect of these and other connected subjects is same as that of the Vaisheshik. So Nyaya theory about physical world is same as that of the Vaisheshik theory of physical world. The Vaisheshik theory, which is a more detailed account of the subject, is accepted by the Nyaya as Saman Tantra or allied theory common to the Nyaya and the Vaisheshik system. So what happens that, as we know that the theory related to physical world is same in Nyaya and Vaisheshik both. In that sense, we consider Vaisheshik philosophy as a Saman Tantra. Now, talking about the individual self and its liberation. What Nyaya says that? Nyaya says that individual selves need to search for truth and freedom. With regard to individual self, which is Jivatma, we have to consider first its nature and attributes. First, we need to understand what is the nature of Jivatma or individual self and what are the attributes of this Jivatma or individual self. Then we will talk about the truth related to the self and the freedom of the self. Now there are four main views of the self in Indian philosophy. So next we will discuss these views about self. First view is about Charvaka. What Charvaka says? They say the self is the living body with the attribute of consciousness. This is the material conception of the self. As you might remember that when we were discussing Charvaka metaphysics, we were talking about this. We were talking that the self is the living body with the attribute of consciousness. And there was this specific word that was given which was Chaitanya Vishisht Deh Ev Atma. So the body with the attribute of consciousness is the self. Now this understanding of Charvaka about the self is material conception of self. Right. Now talking about the Buddha's conception, what they were saying that the self, they reduce the self to a stream of thought or a series of cognitions. They admit only the empirical self. Okay. Next, talking about Advaita Vedanta perspective. What Advaita Vedanta says, they take the self as one, unchanging and self-shining intelligence. That is, self-shining means Swaprakasha Chaitanya, that it is illuminating itself, that it has light in it, which is neither a subject nor an object, neither the I nor the me. And what we call self in Advaita Vedanta, we call it Sat Chit Anand. Right? Now, talking about the Vishisht Advaita Vedanta perspective, what Vishisht Advaita Vedantins hold, they hold that the self is not pure intelligence as such, but an intelligent subject called the ego or the I. They say Gyata Ahamarth Evatma. So their view is also different. Now both these views of the self may be called idealistic. The view of Vishisht Advaita Vedantins and Advaita Vedantins view, both views are idealistic. Charvaka view was materialistic. Now what Nyaya Vaisheshik says, they accept the realistic view of self. So their view is not materialistic, their view is not idealistic, that you have to remember. Sometimes questions come from this point only. Now, according to them, according to the Nyaya Vaisheshik, the self is a unique substance to which all cognitions, feelings and conations belong as its attributes. So self here is a substance, but it is a unique substance, and it has what? It has feelings, cognitions and cognitions as its attributes. Now the soul has other qualities as well, which are desire, aversion, volition, pleasure, pain, cognition. These are also the qualities of soul. These cannot belong to the physical substances, right? We can understand this very easily because physical substances are not conscious. They cannot have the feeling of desire, they cannot feel aversion, they cannot have the feeling of pleasure or pain. So definitely these are the qualities which are specifically belong to the soul, since they are not physical qualities perceived by the external senses. And we also know that physical substances have qualities which we can perceive with the help of external senses, right? So if we take the example of a table, it is a physical substance. It has certain qualities which we can see. Suppose it is brown in color, it is rectangular in shape, and it is hard, so we can touch it and know its hardness. We can see it and know its color, the brown color, and also its shape. So but that table cannot have desire, aversion, volition, pleasure or pain, right? These are some qualities which can only be known through internal sense, right? Hence we must admit that they are the peculiar properties of some substance other than and different from all physical substances. So when we are talking about these qualities, the qualities of desire, pleasure or pain, when we talk about these qualities, what we need some object where these qualities apply. And we know that these qualities cannot be applied to physical substances, right? So what we need some other substance which is not physical in nature. Now there are different cells in different bodies because their experiences do not overlap but are kept distinct. So we know that one person has one self, the other person has the other self, and the reason we know that different people have different selves is that because their experiences are different. One person's experiences cannot be known by the other person unless of course the person say about them, but the experiences of one person is completely uh, private to that person, right? Now the self is indestructible and eternal. Self is eternal and it is indestructible. Self is infinite or ubiquitous. We also called ubiquitous vibhu. Okay, the self is infinite and it is not limited by time and space. The body or the senses cannot be the self. So in this sense, when we are saying that self is infinite and it is not limited by time and space, then we know that body is limited by space and also senses are also limited. Your body has the senses when and also the body is limited by the space and time. So body or senses cannot be the self. The self need to be other than this body and other than the senses. Now because consciousness cannot be the attribute of the material body or the senses. Also we know that consciousness cannot be the attribute of this material body, right? Now the body is unconscious and unintelligent. This is what Nyayikas accept. They are accepting that body is unconscious and unintelligent. And of course, as in the last slide we have seen that body is material substance, right? It is material, but consciousness is not material. So body does not have consciousness. The senses cannot explain functions like imagination, memory, ideation, etc., which are independent of the external senses. So when we talk about imagination, we know that none of our sense is helping in imagination. It is not the work of eyes, or it is imagination is not the work of the tactual sense or visual sense, right, or auditory sense. These things, imagination and memory and ideation, these things are independent of external senses. The manas too cannot take the place of self. Now, as in the first place, Nyayikas have rejected that body cannot be the self, senses cannot be the self. Now they are rejecting that manas can also not be the self. And next they are giving the reason: if the manas be an atomic and therefore imperceptible substance, the qualities of pleasure, pain, etc., which should belong to the manas, must be equally imperceptible. So, as we know that Nyaya Vaisheshikas are accepting the atomic theory of substance. So, in that sense, if manas is an atomic substance, which means it is an imperceptible substance, we cannot see it, then the qualities of pleasure and pain, if they belong to the manas, then these qualities will be imperceptible. Then we will not be able to know whether we are having pleasure or pain. Right? In this sense, manas can also not be the self, because it cannot have the qualities of pleasure and pain. Now, uh, as we know that manas can also not explain the qualities of pleasure and pain, but we experience and we perceive these qualities. So these qualities must exist somewhere, if not in manas, if not in body, if not in senses. Nor can the self be identified with the series of cognitions as in Buddha philosophy. You might remember that when we were studying Buddhist metaphysics, we were talking about this self as a series of cognition. But Nyayikas are saying that we cannot explain the self in this way, because if we will explain the self as a series of cognition, then we will not be able to explain the existence of memory. No member of a mere series of cognition can, like a bead of the rosary, know what has preceded or what will succeed it. And the reason about rejecting the Buddhist conception about self is that no member of a mere series of cognitions know what has preceded or what will succeed it. So suppose if there is like series of cognition, and in that series there are 10 instances, so suppose the third instance, what has happened in the third instance, the cognition of the third instance, that we will not be able to understand what has happened before that and what will happen after that. Okay. Similarly, like in a bead of the rosary, what happens that the one bead does not know that it has a previous bead and a successive bead as well. Now the Advaita Vedantin's idea of self as eternal self-shining intelligence is no more acceptable. So what happens that Nyayikas are also rejecting Advaita Vedantin's idea of self as eternal and self-shining. There is no such thing as pure intelligence unrelated to some subject and object. What happens? What Nyayikas are suggesting? They are suggesting that if Advaita Vedantins are talking about a pure intelligence, as they do talk about a pure intelligence, but they say that this pure intelligence is not related to any subject or any object. This pure intelligence is completely unrelated. But what happens, the Nyayikas are not accepting such kind of pure intelligence which is completely unrelated. Okay, what Nyayikas are saying, they are saying intelligence cannot subsist without a certain locus. That if there is intelligence, it must reside somewhere. It must have a locus. Okay, now hence the self is not intelligence as such, but a substance having intelligence as its attribute. So, after rejecting Advait Vedantin's perspective of pure intelligence, which is completely unrelated to any subject or object, Nyayikas are saying that self is a substance having intelligence as its attribute. So, what is self? Self is a substance, and this substance has the attribute of intelligence. The self is not mere consciousness or knowledge, but a knower, an ego or the I. So self, according to Nyayikas, is a knower or an ego or the I, ahankarasraya, and also an enjoyer, the bhokta, the enjoyer of the fruits of actions. Right? Now, although knowledge or consciousness belong to the self as an attribute, yet it is not an essential and inseparable attribute of it. So what happens, that consciousness belong to the self as an attribute, but it is not an essential and inseparable attribute of it, which means that we can remove consciousness from the self. It is not the inseparable attribute of self. All cognitions or conscious states arise in the self when it is related to the manas, and the manas is related to the senses, and senses come in contact with the external objects. So what happens, that all cognitions or conscious states in the self arises only when the self is related to manas. So there is this self, it is related to the manas, and when they both are related, the self and the mind, only then the cognitions arise. And what happens, that self is related to manas, manas is related to the senses, and senses come in contact with the external object. So what happens, that self, we have self which is connected to mind, and we have mind which is connected to senses, and the senses comes in contact with the external objects. Otherwise there will be no consciousness in the self. In its disembodied condition, therefore the self will have no knowledge or consciousness. So what we have understood is that self is related to manas, manas is related to senses, and senses come in contact with the object. So the knowledge of object comes from sense to manas, and then it comes to self. Thus the attribute of cognition, feeling and conation, in a word consciousness, is an accidental attribute of the self. The accident being its relation to the body. So self is connected to the body with the help of mind and senses, and in this sense consciousness is an accidental quality of the self. Now how do we know that there is any self of the individual which is distinct from his body, his senses and mind? This is a question that arises now. Some old Nyayikas seem to think that there cannot be a perception or direct cognition of self. We cannot perceive the self. We cannot have the direct cognition of self. According to them, the self is known either from the testimony of spiritual authorities or by inference from the functions of desire, aversion, volition, the feelings of pleasure and pain, and the phenomena of knowledge. Now, what happens that as we do not have a direct cognition of self, but we can know about the existence of self in two ways. First, if a spiritual authority tells us about that, like a priest, if the priest says that yes, there is something called the self that exists, or if we infer the existence of self when we see the functions as desire, pleasure and pain. So when we see that yes, there is desire, there is pleasure and there is pain, these desires must be functions or must be attribute of something. So this something cannot be body, this something cannot be the senses, it can also not be the manas. So this something needs to be self only. Now that we have desire, aversion, etc., nobody can doubt. We cannot doubt about the existence of these feelings, the desire, the aversion, the pleasure or the pain. We cannot doubt about the existence of these feelings. But these cannot be explained unless we admit a permanent self. If there is no self, if we are not accepting a permanent self, we cannot explain the desire, the pleasure or the pain, because we need something, and that something has the attribute of desire, pleasure or pain. To desire an object is to strive to obtain it as something pleasurable. So why we have desire of something? Because it is pleasurable, and as it is pleasurable, then we desire to obtain it. So we desire to obtain a pleasurable object, but before we obtain it, we cannot get any pleasure out of it. So if we desire an object and this object is pleasurable, so if we have not obtained this object, we cannot have the feeling of pleasure. After obtaining the object, we can have the feeling of pleasure. So in desiring the object, we only judge it to be similar to such objects as were found to be pleasurable in the past. So what happens that we're desiring an object and it is a pleasurable object, and what happens when we desire it? We can only judge that this object should be a pleasurable object because such objects are pleasurable, and we know this from our past experiences. In our past experience, suppose for example, you ate ice cream one day and it was pleasurable feeling to eat the ice cream. So now you desire to eat the ice cream again because you know it is a desirable object, because it was a pleasurable object in the past. This means that desire supposes some permanent self. Because that self is permanent and the self knows the past experiences, so we had experienced pleasure in relation to certain objects in the past, and which considers a present object to be similar to any of those past objects, and so strive to get possession of it. So this self needs to be permanent because this self has the memory of our past experiences. In the past, when we ate the ice cream, it was pleasurable. So the self remembers our past experiences, and now whenever we have desire of having ice cream, we know that it will be pleasurable as it was in the past. Similarly, aversion and volition cannot be explained without a permanent self. So aversion and volition also need to be understood only with the help of a permanent self, because this permanent self remembers the past experiences of good and bad, and in that sense this self tries to obtain the pleasurable objects and tries to avoid the non-pleasurable objects. The feelings of pleasure or pain also arise in an individual when he gets something considered to be the means of attaining a remembered pleasure, or gets into something which had previously led to a painful experience. So what happens that in past when you ate ice cream, it was a pleasurable feeling. So now what you do, you try to obtain the same ice cream so that you can have again the pleasurable feeling, but you have painful experiences with the fire. So in past when you have touched the fire, your hand was burnt, so you have this painful experience, and now you remember it and you don't want to touch the fire again. So too, knowledge as a process of reflective thinking requires a permanent self. We need a permanent self which performs the action of reflective thinking, which first desires to know something, then reflect on it, and finally attain certain knowledge about it. So first the self tries to or have the desire to know something. Suppose it has the desire to know about a pot, or we can say earthen jar. Then the self reflects on it and finally attains certain knowledge about it, that yes, it is an earthen jar, it is made with a certain material and it is made by someone. Now all these phenomena of desire, etc., cannot be explained either by the body or the senses or the mind as a series of cognitions or a stream of consciousness. So all these phenomena, the phenomena of desire, the phenomena of pleasure, the phenomena of pain, all these phenomena cannot be explained if we take into consideration the body or senses or mind, right? So these things can only be understood in relation to a permanent self. Just as the experience of one man cannot be remembered by another man, so the body or the senses, which are really series of different physiological states and stages, and the mind or the empirical self, which is admittedly an aggregate of different momentary physical states and processes, cannot explain the phenomena of desire, aversion and volition, pleasure, pain and cognition. So what happens that here an analogy is given. Just as one man's experience cannot be remembered by the another one, because one's experience is one's private things. So your experiences cannot be remembered by any other person because the other person does not have the same experiences as you do. So in the similar manner, body or senses cannot remember the experience of self. And also body and senses are series of different physiological states, and mind is a aggregate of different momentary physical states. So what is said here, that body and senses are series of physiological state and mind is aggregate of different momentary physical states. Hence they cannot, neither the body nor the senses nor the mind can explain the desire, aversion, volition, pain. We need to accept a self, a permanent self, to understand the feelings of pleasure, pain, desire, aversion, etc. Now the later Nyayikas go a step further. So we were discussing about the early Nyayikas or old Nyayikas. Now we are talking about the later Nyayikas and their perspective. they maintain that self is directly known through internal or mental perception. So we have a direct perception of self. We can perceive it through internal perception, and this internal perception can be known as, or it can be said as, manas pratyaksha. Manas pratyaksha. Of course, when its existence is denied or doubted by anyone, the self must be inferred and proved in the way explained above. So we were talking about the inferred understanding of self in the previous slides, and now we are also talking about the direct perception of the self. So we have direct perception, we can have direct perception, we can also understand the self as with the help of inference. Now the mental perception of the self may take either of two forms. So when we are talking about the mental perception of self, the direct perception of self, the manas pratyaksh, then it can take two forms. It may be a perception in the form of pure self-consciousness, which is due to a contact between the mind and the pure self and is expressed in the judgment I am. So what happens that the perception in the form of pure self-consciousness. So when you understand the self as pure consciousness and you understand this pure self-consciousness with the contact between mind and self. So self and mind, they have a contact, and with this contact, with the help of this contact, we understand the pure self-consciousness. And this contact can be understood with the help of judgments like I am. So when you say I am, then what you are not a body only, you are not just the collection of body and senses, you are a self. According to some Nyayikas, however, the pure self cannot be an object of perception. Some Nyayikas hold that pure self cannot be an object of perception. You cannot perceive the pure self, or you cannot have the direct perception of pure self. The self is perceived only through some such quality of it as cognition, feeling, or willing, and so the perceptual judgment is in the form I am knowing, I am happy, and so forth. So what the some Nayikas say, they say that self is perceived only through such qualities of feeling or willing. So you cannot know the pure self-consciousness with the help of the contact of self and mind. You can only know the self-consciousness, or you can only perceive the self with the help of the cognitions like feeling, willing, pleasure, pain, etc. and the judgments. Earlier we were talking about the judgment like I am, but here we are saying the judgments like I am knowing. So who is knowing? It is I. I is the one who is knowing. So to know something, there should be some subject and object. So if you suppose you are knowing an object, then there should be a subject. That subject is self. And if you say I am happy, then who is happy? This I is happy. Who is the I? I cannot be the body or the senses. I can only be the self. The self is happy. Now we do not perceive the self as such, but as knowing or feeling or doing something. So what some Nyayikas say? They say that you cannot perceive self as like I am, right? You need to attach some actions with it, like I am knowing or I am feeling. So I am the knower, or I am the one who is having the feeling. So these actions like knowing or feeling, we need to attach these words as well to understand the concept of self. Hence, self-consciousness is a mental perception of the self as present in some mode of consciousness. So what some Nyayikas saying? They say self-consciousness is a mental perception of self as present in some mode of consciousness. Okay, not in all modes of consciousness. It is present in some modes of consciousness. Now, while one's own self can be perceived, other cells in other bodies can only be inferred from their intelligent bodily actions, since these cannot be explained by the unintelligent body and require a conscious self for their performance. So we have already talked about this, that the body is unconscious and the body is unintelligent. The body is not intelligent, body is not conscious. So what happens that, so even if we accept that, you can perceive yourself, but you cannot perceive the self of other person, because we do not have any direct perception. And we do not have direct perception in the sense that in the manner as your self is connected with your mind. So you can have the direct perception of self, but your mind does not have a connection with other self, and that is the reason you cannot know the other cells. But you can infer the other cells, that yes, there is this person in front of me and the person also has the self or the consciousness, and you understand this with the help of inference, and that inference is about the or related to their intelligent bodily actions. So if they are performing actions, they are performing bodily actions which are intelligent. Suppose they are hungry, they are eating, these are the actions, the action of eating something. So you infer the self in the other body with the help of such intelligent actions. Okay, the end of almost all the systems of Indian philosophy is the attainment of mukti or liberation for the individual self. So now talking about the mukti or liberation, and what we understand in Indian philosophy is that most of the systems accept mukti or liberation or freedom from the physical world. This is especially true of the Nyaya system, which proposes at the very outset to give us a knowledge of reality or realities for the realization of the highest good or the summum bonum of our life. So Nyaya also accepts the liberation, the concept of mukti, the concept of freedom from the pain or worldly things. Now the different systems, however, give us different descriptions of this consummate state of the soul's existence. So as they accept soul's existence in different way, they also accept the soul's liberation in different manner. So as we will study the other schools metaphysics, we will talk about their concept of liberation in those videos. So for the Nyayikas, it is a state of negation or complete and absolute of all pain and suffering. So what is the understanding of Nyayikas? It is the negation of all pain, right? Negation of all suffering, that in the state of liberation there is no pain. In the state of liberation there is no suffering. Absolute negation, complete cessation of pain, of suffering. And what they call it apavarga. So the Nyaya's concept of liberation is known as apavarga, and this is also understood as liberation or absolute freedom from all pain. Now this implies that it is a state in which the soul is released from all the bonds of its connection with the body and the senses. So the soul is in complete freedom. The soul is free from the body. The soul is free from the senses. So long as the soul is conjoined with the body, it is impossible for it to attain the state of utter freedom from pain. So what happens? As long as the soul is related with this body or related with the senses, the soul will suffer or it will have pain. But in the state of apavarga, there is no pain. So which means there is no body and there is no senses, there is only freedom. Now the body with the sense organs being there, we cannot possibly prevent their contact with undesirable and unpleasant objects, and so must submit to the inevitable experience of painful feelings. So what happens that as we have the body, we have the sense organs, we definitely will have the contact with objects. There's this contact with the objects, which is known as indriyartha sannikarsha. So whenever we have the contact of objects with the senses, we will have painful experience. The experience can be painful or pleasurable, but you cannot avoid the painful aspect. Hence, in liberation, the soul must be free from the shackles of the body and the senses. So, what we need to free the soul from the body. We need to free the soul from the senses to attain the liberation. But when the severed from the body, the soul ceases to have not only painful but also pleasurable experiences. Nay more, it ceases to have any experience or consciousness. So, what happens when you remove the soul from the grip of the body or the senses? What happens that the experience, all experiences, ceases to be. So whether the experience of pain or the experience of pleasure, there is no experience at all when the soul is not connected with the body. So in liberation, the self exists as a pure substance, free from all connection with the body, neither suffering pain, nor enjoying pleasure, nor having consciousness. So what happens when the consciousness is not in the grip of the body and the senses? There is no feeling at all. There is no feeling of pain. There is no feeling of pleasure. Now, liberation is the negation of pain. You have to remember this, that it is negation of pain, not in the sense of a suspension of it for a longer or shorter period of time, as in good sleep or state of recovery from some disease, or that of relief from some bodily or mental affliction. So what is it? That liberation is not temporary here. It is not like when you have recovered from a disease and you feel temporary relief. It is not similar to that, or it is not similar to a good sleep when you have no consciousness about anything, not even about your existence. It is a permanent negation of pain. It is absolute freedom from pain for all time to come. And of course, when there will be no body, no senses, no contact with the sense objects, so of course, definitely there will be no feeling, not of pain, not of pleasure. It is just that supreme condition of the soul which has been variously described in the scriptures as freedom from fear, abhayam, freedom from decay and change, ajaram, freedom from death, amrityu padam, and so forth. So what happens that soul attains these states, the state of abhayam, ajaram, or amrityupadam, and these states have been described in scriptures. So these states are freedom from fear, freedom from decay, freedom from change, freedom from death. So freedom from everything in a sense. To attain liberation, one must acquire a true knowledge of the self and all other objects of experience, tattva jnanam. So to attain liberation, what we need to have tattva gyan. We need to have the true knowledge. True knowledge about what? True knowledge about the self, true knowledge about the objects, true knowledge of oneself, true knowledge of the body, true knowledge about the senses, and true knowledge about all other objects of experience. He must know the self as distinct from the body, the mind, and the senses. We need to understand that self is not the body, self is not the mind, self is not the senses. Self is something unique. It is a unique substance which has the feeling of pleasure and pain, volition, aversion. We have to understand this. Then only we can have an idea of liberation, and then only we can understand the liberation. So for this, he should first listen to the scriptural instructions about the self, that is Shravan. So to have the true knowledge about self, to have the true knowledge about the objects of the world, what we need to do, we need to listen to scriptural instructions about self. Not all the scriptural instructions, but the scriptural instructions about the self. We have to do the Shravana. Then he should firmly establish the knowledge of the self by means of reasoning. Then we have to do the Manan. First, we have to listen the scriptural understanding. Then we have to establish the knowledge of self. So first the listening, then the understanding of self. Then we have to establish the understanding of self with the help of reasoning, which is also known as Manan. Finally, we have to meditate on the self in conformity with the principles of yoga. Then we have to do Nididhyasan. So Shravan, Manan and Nididhyasan. These three are the steps. These help to realize the true nature of the self as distinct from the body and all other objects. So in this way, with the help of Shravan, Manan and Nididhyasan, we understand that self is not the body, self is not the senses, and self is not the manas. And with this realization, the wrong knowledge, that is mithya gyan, is destroyed. So the mithya gyan about the self, about the body, about the senses, or about the other objects is destroyed. The mithya gyan, like I am the body and the mind, this mithya gyan is also destroyed. When the mithya gyan is destroyed, what happens? One ceases to be moved to action by passions and impulses. Then the person has the understanding, and the person do not perform actions on the basis of passions and impulses. Now, when a man becomes thus free from desires and impulses, he ceases to be affected by the effects of his present actions done with no desire for fruits. So what happens when the person is free from desires, free from impulses? The person has attained the understanding of self. What happens? That the person no more gets affected by his present actions. And even if the person is performing the actions, the person does not have desire for fruits. His past karmas or deeds being exhausted by producing their effects, the individual has to undergo no more births in this world. So when you have the correct understanding or the true knowledge about the self, about the mind and the body and the senses, then what happens? You perform actions with no desire of fruits. And also what happens, that you are performing actions but you do not have any desire for its fruit, and your past karmas exhaust their effects. So what happened? That there is no more birth in this world. Then there is no more janm in the world. The cessation of birth means the end of his connection with the body and consequently of all pain and suffering, and this is liberation. So what happens? That there is no more birth. When you are not going to be born again, there will be no body, there will be no senses, there will be no mind. And when there is no body, there is no feeling of pleasure or pain or aversion. So consequently, pain and suffering is destroyed. Consequently, you are liberated. So you are liberated with the help of true knowledge of true knowledge of self. Right? That was all for this lecture. In next lecture, we will study Vaisheshik metaphysics. And if you have any question, you can ask in the comment box. Thank you.